Good morning to everyone, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Really matters today. For some reason, I'm having that morning. At any rate, what we're going to talk about, let me close chat, otherwise I will talk to you folks the entire time. Okay. What we're going to talk about is, as advertised on a variety of different social media platforms, schools, classrooms as cultural battlegrounds. I've been inspired by some obvious things that have been in the news, also by the fact that, by the fact that the new semester has started. And I know we have a lot of people here who are educators, and so there you all are. I am on leave this semester, so some little part of me is, since this is the week school started at Yale, this is the week I begin feeling a little sense of sort of wonderfulness because I'm not working while everyone else is. But that's not true. I'll be working in other ways. However, for all of these reasons, it seemed like a good time and a good place, given the people who are here, to talk a little bit about classrooms as battlegrounds, cultural battlegrounds. However, before we begin, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted every Friday to join in this community and to work with Joanne and John and everyone. We have already a very active chat going, as many of you can see if you're joining us on Zoom. And I never checked the Facebook. I want to do that one day. I don't know if they chat the way we do through Facebook, but anyway, we always have terrific questions submitted by folks like you, and those need to go in the Q&A box that hopefully you see along the bottom of your screen. So in about 30 minutes, we will share those questions with Joanne and enjoy her responses, as well as engaging in the chat. So I'll see you guys in about a half an hour.
Wonderful. Okay. There we go. Okay. So as I said a moment ago, what set me off in this direction, in addition to the fact that everyone is going back to school, was news that I read mostly about Florida, a little bit about Texas, mostly about Florida. Florida, most particularly in the last few days, has declared that they are banning right now what is in test phases of an African-American AP history course. And I think I got the language here. So this is the language from the Department of Education in Florida. Many of you have probably seen this in the press, that as presented, the content of this course is inexplicably contrary to Florida law and significantly lacks educational value. Now, I went on a little hunt this morning to see if I could find out what that means, because of course in this statement there's no explanation of what that means at all. There's just that blunt statement that it lacks educational value. The most that I could find was in the National Review by someone, I believe from a think tank, who said that he got a copy of the curriculum for this AP history course, and that in his mind, it was an indoctrinating, woke agenda, teaching CRT, blah, blah, blah. The best that I could make of that was, and I shouldn't be laughing because there's nothing to laugh at here. He's upset that they're teaching about racism. He's also upset that some of the people who contributed to that curriculum have written other things that he considers radical. So part of what I saw in this article in the National Review, you're all welcome to go find it, read it for yourself, by this fellow whose name I brilliantly didn't write down, that he thinks it's indoctrinating students, it's making them hate America and want to turn America into a socialist country. It's upset that it's teaching about the history of Black studies. Let's see, I have a quote here from him. The larger danger here is that once this AP African American Studies is approved, we will see the College Board devise AP courses in GASP, women's studies, gender studies, transgender studies, Latino studies, environmental studies, the full panoply of politicized studies courses that have balkanized and politicized higher education. This will drain off students from AP US history and quickly convert high schools into woke bastions. So this is the sort of wild fear going on about this curriculum and what it's opening the door to. Oh no. The fact that some of the people criticizing this are upset that it's teaching about the place of racism in American society. And, linking that with the idea, we've probably talked about it one way or another, but certainly you've seen it a lot in the press, the idea that somehow or other, if you acknowledge racism, you are teaching students to hate America and that students should love America. And so we shouldn't focus on these bad things, but we should train students to love the country, as though you can't recognize your country for what it is, can see the good and the bad, and still say, I love this country and the potential it has, and I'm willing to work to move it towards a better future. Heaven forbid that that's what we think. But at any rate, when I was digging around this morning in preparation for this, that's some of the criticism that I saw. On the other hand, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was a former chair of Harvard's Department of African and African American Studies and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, said, in the history of any field, in the history of any discipline in the academy, there are always milestones indicating the degree of institutionalization. And he was a consultant to this project, this new curriculum. These are milestones which signify the acceptance of the field as being quote unquote academic and quote unquote legitimate. And he compared the idea of this course with the publication of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature in 1997 and of the African American National Biography published in 2008. So the simple fact that this exists in and of itself is important. The fact that it talks about racism, I'm not even going to go down a path after the fact that people are upset that a course on African American history and studies is talking about racism. Teaching American history without teaching about racism is not teaching American history. So at any rate, that's some of the fuss that's going on right now in Florida. Also, we have coming from Florida, a newer memo that requires state university system members to report, this is the language from this statement, expenditures and resources utilized for campus activities related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and critical race theory, because you always got to throw that in there, even though, anything that apparently that has anything to do with race at all is critical race theory. And this notice sent to these campuses wants a documentation process for universities to provide a comprehensive list of all staff, faculty, programs, and campus activities that might fall under the categorization of diversity or inclusivity. Okay, so if you're teaching a course that seems to be about diversity, you better be put on this list because you're teaching something dangerous, something that's going to teach you to hate America. I mean, the logic of this, not only does the logic of this not work, but the House Speaker discussing this, coming right from the fact that he says, anything that is categorized as diversity, we need to put it on the list. He then says, quote, colleges and universities have an obligation to foster diversity of thought on their campuses and be good stewards of state dollars. So apparently diversity doesn't actually mean diversity, right? Diversity means you can't talk about race in a way that we don't like. And if you're doing that, and we can't see some exact opposite put up right alongside next to it, then you're dangerous and you're teaching people some kind of indoctrinated idea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can sort of construct the whole article here. Texas, not far behind, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, complained that history in the United States, people are being taught that America is evil. People are not being taught to love their country, and that Americans should not be taught that America is evil. In Washington last year, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and more than 36 Republican senators protested a proposed Biden administration rule promoting education programs that address how racism is embedded in society. And these senators called it, quote, divisive nonsense. Okay, we can go on like this and be really angry. I can. So what I wanted to talk about today, first of all, was to highlight that, and then to talk a little bit about the fact that classrooms and education have, in one way or another, always been politicized, not always in the same way. And what we're seeing now, these claims, it's not as though they're absolutely new. They're not. We are in a particular moment when there's sort of an extreme backlash to some unquestioned progress in increasing diversity and inclusivity, and some of what we're seeing is a response to that. But the fact of the matter is, and of course, I've talked a little bit about this before in a different way, when you go back to the beginning of the Republic, education was very politicized and seen as a kind of cultural, political training ground. And I suppose you could say that Americans were trying to indoctrinate the students. What Americans, what elite folk thinking about this would have told you is that Americans needed to understand what American civic identity was, what it meant to be an American citizen versus what it meant to be a British subject. And education was going to be the place where you learned civic virtue and ideas about citizenship and what it was that made the United States the United States. Part of this, and we've talked about this a little bit before too, had to do with also educating women, not in the same ways or to the same degree as men, but if you needed people to be raised, particularly children, to be proper small r Republican citizens of a republic, then the mothers and wives were going to have to be crucial. They were a central part of this education effort. So there was more focus on educating women, again, for this, quote unquote, agenda to teach Americans what ideas and ideals were American versus British. This was taken to the point that Noah Webster, even, and I highly recommend that you do this if you haven't already, was proposing an Americanized version of English where the spelling corresponded with the way Americans pronounce things. He was very much against all of the U's, like labor, L-A-B-O-R, not L-A-B-O-U-R, heaven forbid, the British U. He wanted the language to reflect the United States and not England. So education, certainly in the early Republic, was seen as a way to, again, small r, republicanize, demonarchize, I suppose, Americans, to teach them what a good citizen in the United States was in one way or another, to get them to recognize what a republic is and what a threat to the republic would look like, so that they could rise up and recognize and fight against threats to the republic. So you could say, right, in a sense, I suppose, that was a political agenda. It was a political agenda that at that particular moment, in the way that I'm talking about here, it was national, but it was a new nation, right? So they were trying to figure out what differentiated the new nation from the one that it had broken away from. That was the project. And so what they're doing here is actually in a very blunt, in-your-face, direct, and in their mind, practical way, teaching students what it meant to be American. At this point, there are many different versions of what it meant to be American, but unlike today, it's not as though we have two polarized visions and you have to pick one or the other. People were deciding what they thought the United States was. So again, politicized, had political value, was tied to civic virtue and citizenship, national identity. Oops, hang on here. Flipping my pages here. That idea certainly didn't end with the early republic, and I'm not going to go into great depth, but there's a wonderful literature on textbooks and what textbooks did or didn't include as history, right? And in one way or another, a lot of what we're talking about here is the whitewashing of history, and that's certainly true for textbooks. You can apply that word to some of what we're seeing going on right now in Florida and Texas and other places. I probably didn't write down this wonderful statement, which I should have, that there were 137 individual bills being discussed around the country that had to do with banning in one way or another discussion of race or racism. Don't quote me on that because I brilliantly did not write that down, but you could probably find it. And I think the number was 137, which is up from 122 last year, I think. At any rate, we're at a moment where people are drawing lines, and a supreme place where people always have felt that lines should be drawn is schools and education, always. So if you're looking for a place where cultural battles are being fought, very often, if you plug into debate, argument about what's being taught in classrooms, you'll get right to the heart of it. There's a student, I'm on her dissertation committee at Yale, and that's part of what she's doing about her dissertation is about education and the ways in which how people understood manhood and women and American values, how that was being explicitly taught in classrooms in a very deliberate way. Again, this isn't sneaky, this isn't hidden, this is pretty direct, but this is a long-standing argument that right now is front and center in a way that it isn't always. But again, the end goal here, in one way or another, is to quash the teaching of racism and label everything critical race theory that has anything to do with race, which is really inaccurate, to mask or hide or not teach ways in which the United States has failed in the past, and just sort of teach a heroic American history, which of course totally cuts the past off from the present and offers no insight into how we've gotten to where we are in the present. You cannot understand the United States as a country if you carefully prune away discussion of racism and a lot of other kinds of isms that were there, whether you want to talk about them or not. So if you're taking all of those things away and saying that's American history, it's not. It's a little tiny portion of American history, just like the idea that African American history is somehow not American history, right? That it doesn't have value, it's somehow not American history. There's a lot of assumptions going on here that have very problematic logic to them. So on the one hand, some of what's going on here is really blatant, right? It's really like we can't talk about race because it makes white children feel guilty. On the other hand, we have people in power on a state level who are asserting this kind of logic. Part of what I have noted here, and I don't want to take all of our time, but one thing worth considering and possibly even worth talking about is it's one thing to set national standards. It's quite another thing to talk about local standards. And some of what we're seeing here when it comes to education is that on a local level, on local school boards, local departments of education, on a state level, you're seeing a lot of action depending on the politics of that particular state or county or city, in which they're taking action along these lines. And because of federalism, right, that genius compromise at the Federal Convention, federalism, which said, you know what, the national government won't be all powerful, local government, state government, that will be vitally important too. You will have divided sovereignty between the two, and that way we will not be one big unified national blob of power, right? What a fine thing federalism enabled the Constitution to pass because people weren't terrified, as they might have been, at an entirely national everything, national government, national culture and everything else without the local ties that Americans had been born into. And again, so we've talked about this before, their state, their colony, and then their state is their own country. But what federalism then does, by definition, is enable things to happen on a state level that may conflict with things happening on a national level. Then you have to look towards the courts, maybe ultimately towards the Supreme Court. That's another conversation that we're not going to go into. But at any rate, what we're looking at is a bundle of interacting components of the American political system. People wanting to enforce schools as training grounds for what they want America to be. Federalism allowing states, towns, cities, counties to do this on a local level. In all kinds of ways, people are using the American system in a way that it can be used, but they're doing it in pursuit, not, the fact that it's a really 1984 component to people saying we want to clamp down on courses that are about diversity because we need diversity in our classrooms. Diversity meaning we're talking too much about people who aren't white. We need more discussion of happy, white people who can be heroes. And why are you focusing on all these other people? There's it's going to be an obvious thing to say, but there's an obvious, if you're used to having 100% of the pie, and someone comes along and says, you know what, you don't deserve 100% of the pie. Part of that pie needs to go to other people. You're going to feel really deprived, that you're being deprived of something you're not really entitled to, 100% of something, simply by giving a piece of pie to somebody else. And in some way or another, that's some of what we're seeing now, is people who have been raised to assume that things are a certain way, education is a certain way, they have a certain kind of power, history is taught a certain way. It places white men at the center of it unquestionably, and anything that veers from that and says, you know what, there are other people that are part of the story. You know what, there are other things we need to teach. It feels like an attack. If you feel entitled when someone says, no, you know what, other people are entitled to something too, it feels like an attack, and you, as we're watching, respond accordingly. Now, one thing I've talked about before and that I do want to mention is even if these many bills, proposals, ideas about education, let's say that they get action in some way in Florida, they're talked about in other states, but they aren't acted on. Here's the important thing about that. And this is, in a way, the premise of my last book entirely, which is the South had power in Congress, partly because they were willing to be violent. They were occasionally violent. Most important of all, people believed they would be violent. And what that means is that people were intimidated into not acting up against Southerners, not speaking out against slavery, because they knew these guys, they were tough characters, they were willing to fight, better to just stay seated and be silent. Some of what we're looking at here in this, all of this discussion of these proposals and bills and list making, some of that is purely an attempt to intimidate, right? To threaten, to make people think twice. Ooh, I want to teach a course and it has the word race in the title. Should I do that? Can I do that? Maybe I should think of another word. It's logical that people who are worried about their jobs would think in that way. Even if you're not worried about your job, right? If you're told you'll be punished for something, some people might stand up and test that. Other people, they're going to at least think twice. And that right there is the intimidation, the threats and intimidation that really wrangle others into complying or being silent. And that's some of what we're seeing now in all of these educational proposals that are floating around and that are beginning to get some press. It's an intimidation maneuver. Now, I want to do two things. I want to read a statement that I wrote a while back that I keep, again, on various social media platforms, reprinting again and again and again, because in one way or another, it keeps being important. And then I want to make one final point, and then we can open things up to questions. So I was asked, and I don't even remember now, it's a couple of years ago, it might have been Newsweek. I was asked by a media outlet to talk about the teaching and learning of history, and what I thought of it. And this was probably at some other big fuss about explicitly the teaching of history. I don't even remember which one, since we've had so many recently. But this is how I replied to this unknown journalist for the unknown publication. Learning history involves evaluating documents from the past, seriously considering conflicting ideas, drawing conclusions based on reliable evidence, debating ideas with others, and owning the bad as well as the good in a nation's past. It requires an open mind. It involves wrestling with the uncomfortable as well as uncovering the admirable. The only way to truly know and love a nation is to embrace it in all its complexity, including its sins as well as its virtues, and work for a better future. The study of history, the sincere, open, and serious study of history in all its complexity, is dangerous and misleading only if you have something to hide. And it's impossible to understand ourselves as a nation and to reckon with the roots and implications of our current moment if we deny the uncomfortable parts of America's past. That's a statement I stand behind. It seems as though something that it shouldn't need to be said, and yet here we are. So normally I conclude these discussions with a sort of recommendation of what this might do to how we're thinking about acting in the present. In this case, part of what I want to say is obvious, but needs to be said. And that is, watch what's happening on a local level. Watch what's happening on your local level and get involved. Watch for patterns, as good historians will do, of what's happening in general. What we're going to see, what we have been seeing and are going to continue to see is things happening on a state level to take control of the nation's historical and cultural narrative. And as we often see, right, it's relatively easy to do that sort of thing, kind of get it under the radar, and by the time people notice, it's heading away in full swing. So part of what I'm saying here is assume that people where you live in your state are going to be thinking about and talking about education and history education, because they will, because education matters, and history education has to do with how people understand the nation, has to do with possibly what their politics are, and thus has to do with political power. Watch where you are to see what's going on. Don't wait for it to leap out at you, but look to see what your Department of Education is saying. Obviously, we've known that school boards now are charged arenas, but again, look in that direction too. Watch what's happening. Watch how people are trying to shift the conversation or silence part of the conversation or outlaw part of the conversation or pretend that part of the conversation is disloyal or unpatriotic or a lie, right? Evidence, looking at and evaluating evidence, debating different ideas so that you can come to an understanding that you didn't have before you began debating. All of the things that make up good learning and good history. There are people who are pretty blatantly trying to prevent them from happening and putting a flag on that and claiming that it's patriotism. Watch for what's happening locally, because it matters, and things can happen on a local level more quickly than you might realize. And it's important to keep your eyes open and watch what people are doing. Watch for the language that people are using when they talk about education. That too, as a historian, I do that all the time when I'm looking at the past. I look to see the words that people use when they discuss things, even words that seemingly aren't important, but if you see a similar word used again and again and again, and it's a word that seems slightly noticeable in some way, very often that's a really interesting link, sign of what people are thinking on a deeper level not stating, but revealing in their choice of words. So at any rate, I'm now going past the time when I should be speaking. At any rate, that's my recommendation for this week, is to realize that in one way or another, education always has some kind of political component to it. There are different ways in which that can happen. There are different directions it can be. But if someone is saying that you should deny part of our history, a really obvious part of our history, right? The legacy of it, we live with it every day. That's a problem. And that's something that we need to see and we need to address. Okay. I'm now like at the point where I'm trying to beat them mug. If there's anyone here who's new, every week I have a mug that in some way or another relates to the theme. Today I picked the mug and I was like, you guys are all going to know exactly what mug it is, but there's no way I could pick another mug, is there? History should make you uncomfortable.
Predictions. We actually had predictions in the chat about 20 minutes ago that would be the mug.
How could it not be? When I picked it, I was almost like disappointed in myself. I was like, oh man, this is an easy one. It's oh, now we have, now we're gonna have like mug picking prizes. This is what happens when you only have a limited amount of mugs. Okay, I'm going to shut up, and so that we can, and let me say something actually as we open this. Since there are a lot of people here, mug bingo, since there are a lot of people here who are educators, I hope that you will weigh in not only with questions, but also with thoughts about the topic generally, about how you as a teacher are thinking about it, because this will be a great forum for that kind of discussion. I also want to say, which I forgot to say at the outset, if you are here for the first time, if this is your first or maybe second time beaming into History Matters, so does coffee, please say so in chat, because the History Matters community, I've already forgotten, 146th straight episode, I think, is what I read. The History Matters community is an amazing community, and you will be welcomed right in. So if you are here for the first time, please do let folks know. Okay, now I will stop and we can have a conversation.
Great. And we have a first timer, Ann Lutz Fernandez, and she already put something in the Q&A.
Yay!
I know.
Excellent.
Okay, so Ann, I don't know if she is an educator, maybe she can tell us in the chat, but it kind of sounds like she is based on this question. She says, I've been incredibly frustrated by the College Board's failure to be active in the fight against educational censorship. Do we have any hope that DeSantis may have pushed them into finally taking part in the fight? I actually have a little inside information on that, but I'll let you go first.
Well, if you have inside information, I'll let you go first, because I'm talking in a more general way.
So I had put in the chat, so I actually had an opportunity to review this course, this AP African American Studies course, before the pilot year started and offer feedback as a teacher. It is not CRT, but what I was really pleased to see, because I agree with you, Anne, in the past, College Board has tried to stay very neutral because in the end, they want to make money and sell more tests. The College Board came out about a year ago, March, with a very firm statement from Trevor himself, the College Board guy, saying any state, when all these divisive concepts laws started, book banning, he said any state that alters their AP syllabus in any way to fit around a divisive concept law. In other words, if you cut sections out, you say, we're not going to teach this or this because my governor says so, or my school board says so, we're not going to read this book. He said your AP privileges will be revoked.
Wow.
We have never heard anything like that from College Board. So, Anne, this is the time now where we're going to see if Trevor really meant what he said a little over a year ago, because we expect him to stick by that. You know, that statement was widely circulated. I use it in my slideshows when I present to teachers. So they have come out in writing, and they did it before the course was piloted, I think, as a way, because they knew this was coming. They definitely knew this was coming. So that's what I know. But Joanne, I'll let you. And sorry,
that's way better
like that, but I just couldn't not say.
No, that's good. That's way better than anything I would have known, and encouraging. And I see already the people have already like beamed in links to the statement if you want to have access to that statement directly. I had no idea about that, and that's really encouraging. And also, given that you saw this as a teacher, I can only judge based on what felt to me like not very logical things that people were claiming about the course. And it sounds like from what you're saying, they were not very logical. I mean, the idea, and this is obvious, but the idea, if someone is just throwing around critical race theory and woke randomly with no meaning attached to them, and when actually we've seen in news media outlets, when someone says, well, what do you actually mean by critical race theory? They can't answer the question. Those are just, no, critical race theory now just means talking about race in a way I don't like, right? So it's totally detached from what it really is, or acknowledging racism. Acknowledging that there's racism in the United States is not critical race theory, right? And woke has now just become a word that means things we don't like, that seem as though the left likes them, and we don't.
Well, that list that you read that DeSantis said, what's next? Women's studies, right. Latinx, Asian American. I'm like,
environmental studies. I was like, whoa, wouldn't that be great? Environmental.
There's already an AP environmental science course. It's been around for years. It's already there. Like, do your math before you make ridiculous statements. That
well, there were a lot of those ridiculous statements. As a matter of fact, I think in that same, no, a different statement. This was in Texas. Someone said, this is the lieutenant governor of Texas said, well, you know, tenured professors, research professors, maybe they could talk about this stuff, but classroom professors, they shouldn't. There's no difference.
I have the same credential. This is crazy.
Same person, right? It was just like, oh man, like.
The thing that really upset me yesterday, AP Euro history has been around for decades. It has been criticized for decades. It acts as if everybody in Europe is white. The curriculum is very antiquated and stale, and kids have stopped taking that course. Has declined in enrollment for years because they never update it, and it's not as robust, and it doesn't tell the full and complete story of everybody in Europe, right? Just like many of our US history courses didn't until more recent years. So it just, that infuriated me that the Euro history course, they love that one. They encourage people to take that one. And it's just,
right.
Anyway.
I did want to also say, I see that Tim put a link to a brief history of critical race theory from the New York Times. I will also self-promote and say that someone's going to get bingo. That on my podcast Now and Then that I co-host with Heather Cox Richardson, we did an episode a while back on critical race theory, what it actually was, and how it's now being used, which I think also did a good job of this. So if you are interested in listening to that, you can find it online somewhere.
I'm sure someone will put it in there.
Carolee, man. Guys.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Miranda, as a follow-up question to Anne's excellent question, Miranda, who is not feeling well today, so we hope you feel better, Miranda. She wanted to know, how do textbooks still reflect the influence of the Daughters of the Confederacy even today? I was trying to pull up this graphic I have. It's a couple of years old, but a UVA EDU professor analyzed all the textbooks that have been approved for adoption in Virginia. But because she's college, she used PowerPoint instead of Google Slides, so I can't just share it. I don't
one of my colleagues in grad school wrote about that too.
Yeah.
And
I'll put it in Slack. That's what I'll do. I can put it in Slack later today. For those of you who are new, we have a Slack community for History Matters. And if you're new and you'd like to be included, put Slack in all caps, your name and your email, preferably a Gmail. But if you don't have a Gmail, either make one or give us whatever email and we will add you. But anyway, the professor's name, to give her credit, is Alexa Quinn. And it showed how there were only 14 Native Americans mentioned, only 9 African Americans mentioned, compared to, it was 67% white people were mentioned, only 27% African American, 4% Native American, 2% Latinx, not a single Asian American. Now, this was the last textbook adoption cycle, so this is about 8-year-old data. But the textbooks haven't changed that much in 8 years. We'll be going through this again if we ever get our standards adopted, because we're fighting over that in Virginia now. But
and that's, again, related to what I said at the outset. Think how hard it is. It's so much easier to stay rooted in the past than it is to encourage and allow and foster and put in practice change. And that's some of what we're seeing too. I want to read Nancy Pickering, first timer, welcome. Very nice to see you here. But I want to read, if folks have missed this, what she just put in chat. I am a school board member of a public K-12 school in upstate Western New York. We have seen national organizations guiding local parents, guardians to approach school boards during public comment to question curriculum and try to ban library books. There is a misunderstanding of what a board of education is, governance, versus the school district's function of educating all students, developing curriculum, and making sure all students can become productive, successful citizens. That the difference between a board of education and a school board, this is significant, is important. And Nancy, I want to first of all welcome, because particularly with this episode, it's wonderful to have you here. And if you haven't checked out NCHE yet, I encourage that as well, because that's why we're here doing what we do, because of the National Council of History Education. But at any rate, I didn't talk about school board meeting and people being organized to control curricula and ban books and silence things. But as you just suggested, Nancy, that's a huge topic.
all right, we've got more questions.
Okay.
This next one is from our friend Dave. He says, given the decline in those who pursue PhDs in history and the number of students majoring in history, who will be qualified to teach US history in 10 or 15 years?
Right. There's a question. And we're talking, when you're talking about PhDs, right? So there are several crises happening at the same time. And one of them is colleges and universities clamping down on the number of humanities majors because, oh, heck, what do the humanities get you, right? Nothing. It's all science, right? If you think about the humanities as something that actually teaches you the fundamentals of humanity, that's really important. But at any rate, because of that, and because there are just fewer people being produced by universities who are going to be history professors, and because universities themselves sometimes are having fewer positions, or even having history departments pruned, or in a handful of cases, I think, even eliminated? That's a really good question. And I can say, from firsthand experience, I'm watching the number of graduate students that we admit in our department shrink, which partly has to do with demand. I don't know the answer to that question, but all of these crises are interrelated, right? So the fact that the humanities are being attacked throughout education, the fact that PhD programs are not cranking out as many PhDs because there aren't as many jobs, then the question of who's going to value history, who's going to teach history, who's going to do what needs to be done, right? Which is, we have to, I'm going to get up on my soapbox and I won't. There is no way we can address the current moment without an understanding of our history. There is just no way. And if at this moment, this is the moment when people are saying, we don't want to look at that history, it makes us feel bad. Okay, you're supposed to, in some way or another, be uncomfortable with some of the things that happened in the past and wrestle with what that means. Oh, that was a bad thing. This should never have happened, but it did. Why did it happen? What does it show about where the nation was at the time? And what does it show about where we are now? Those aren't coded questions. Those are, historically informed questions. Anyway, I'm going to stop. But it's a big question and it's a looming crisis. And I think it's no accident that in the last few years, when I've been out doing public-minded work, there are a lot of people who just don't know really basic things about our government, about democracy, and about history, not because they're lazy people or don't care about education, but because they haven't had the resources. They haven't been encouraged to do things that we should all encourage others to do and should all do ourselves. Okay, I'll stop. I know we probably have a lot of questions.
We do. This one comes from Dale. He says, given that Jefferson's idea of education prioritized history as the first and most important part of the curriculum, what did his view of history look like?
I'm sorry, repeat that question for me.
He said that given that Jefferson's idea of education prioritized history, he was wondering what the curriculum under that kind of history looked like.
Well, so here's what's interesting. I was playing around this morning and I did not successfully come up with the letter where he says this, but in later life, you know, his sort of retirement years project of creating the University of Virginia, he was always very focused on the education system in Virginia, and he saw in New England how New England towns were really effective units, and that in the realm of education, you know, Virginia should have like wards, and they should. I tried to find the actual phrase and did not, but you know, should rake the geniuses from the rubbish. So basically, you know, give everyone a certain education, and then pull people who are not necessarily elite and give them an education. He was always very focused on education. But at UVA, he had a moment when he could think about the curriculum. And the thing I went looking for this morning and couldn't find is he was talking about, and of course, one of you will, because this is you. He's talking about Hume, David Hume, and history that David Hume wrote. And what he said in this letter was, we can teach that, we can include that at UVA, but it has to be corrected because the slant of it isn't quite right for Americans, which I thought was fascinating, right? So he, logically enough, along the lines of what I said at the outset, right? There's someone thinking, oh, it's important that Americans think American thoughts, and Hume might be a little bit too, I don't know, monarchical to indoctrinate students. So you can look, actually, that would be where I would send you, would be to go to Founders Online through the National Archives. And then there's a huge blob of letters about Jefferson and the University of Virginia, because that's where he was having those kinds of discussions. There's a reason why. So I've always found this fascinating about both Yale and UVA. So the Yale, you know, the main green, the main campus, the original Jeffersonian part, has the rotunda at its top. And the rotunda was seen as like a, you know, bastion of science, where you could, you know, very Enlightenment-esque, right? You could explore science and understand the world in a different way. Yale School of Divinity is an exact replica of UVA.
I did not know
that green, except instead of a science-based rotunda, there's a church. And you just got to know that Jefferson's just rolling in his grave somewhere. It's actually very weird. I'm speaking as a person who got her PhD at UVA. First time I went there, they even have UVA has these like almost like an optical illusion. It'll have a flat green and then it goes up and a flat green. The Divinity School even mocks that as well. So if you're ever curious, I haven't gone back in many, many years, but the fact that there's a church where the rotunda should be right there tells you something about Jefferson's view of education and perhaps a more traditional New Englandy view of education.
Wow, I'll have to go up and see that sometime. All right, our friend Cece asked, when you talk about education as a way to be anti-British, i.e. the crown-controlled education in some way, to be pro-American democracy in the early republic, how much of today's book banning and syllabus control feels circular history? Does it seem like we are turning towards authoritarianism through education, maybe?
Well, it's hard to use the phrase book banning and not think about authoritarianism, right? It's one thing to say, here's a specific book that I'm not sure about. Let's talk about it. I don't know if there's a book that shouldn't be in school libraries that fits into that category, perhaps. It's another thing to say anything that talks about sexuality, anything that really focuses on race, anything that talks about civil rights, all of that should be banned. I don't think, basically books should not be banned, but if you particularly have a sort of master plan to just ban books that talk about things that you don't like, if you're starting to tell people what words they can and can't use, looking at you, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, wow. Latinx. If you're starting to tell people what they can and can't read, what they can and can't say, what they can and can't think, you're moving into authoritarian territory. Now, on the left, people might say, if they're on the right, well, but you folks on the left, like you have the certain ways you like to talk and you get angry at other people when they don't talk the way you talk. Get angry all you want. Don't ban books, it's one thing to say, I don't like what the left thinks. And it's another to set for the left to say, we are banning all conservative texts from our libraries because we don't like them. That's not what's going on right now. So once you get into the realm of banning, like really banning, and not really any willingness to have being like we've seen recently, I think it's Joy Reid maybe, who said to someone in an interview, well, you want to ban anything that has critical race theory in it. Well, so tell me, Mr. Politician, what is critical race? Oh, it was woke policies in the military. So what is a woke policy of the military? Right. If you
integrated barracks.
I don't know. But at any rate, I'm veering all over the place because I'm getting myself very worked up about this topic. I'll stop. I'll stop.
I was trying to keep myself in check because I have so many thoughts on this topic. Okay, our friend Gloria asked.
You could say something.
No, I'm like this whole topic in general, because we're in such a contentious standards debate here in Virginia right now. And I'm seeing years of progress trying to be undone, Anyway, our friend Gloria asks, does it not balkanize U.S. history to divide it by African-American? I have not seen Jewish American AP or Italian American AP or women's history AP. Is this a dangerous trend to divide history up that way?
Personally, I don't think so. Why would it be to have to study a theme? The same reason like studying environmental history. I do think it's worth, when you're doing that, it's worth teaching it in a way that makes it clear that women's history isn't separate. African-American history isn't separate, that the part of American history, right? So the framing matters. But I don't really see that as balkanization at all. I think students should take US history. I also think they should be totally free to take other kinds of courses that will teach them other kinds of viewpoints about other kinds of things that have been other kinds of people, groups, and fights of various sorts that define American history. Why shouldn't they know about that in addition to whatever other courses that they're taking? So to me, that doesn't feel divisive at all. Particularly, given that often some of those histories are explicitly the things not being included in more conventional history courses, they definitely need to be taught. If that's the way to get them taught for the moment, okay. They need to be included as a central part of American history because they are. They are. And sort of blocking them out or not including them, the damage that does in part is simply by declaring that, kind of along the line of what Henry Louis Gates said, that they don't count, they're not legitimate, they're not part of American history. I don't know. To me, the more the merrier, like learn about different people in America study history thematically as well as in a more comprehensive way. But that's my view.
All right. Our friend Dave asks, with regard to federalism, compare and contrast today's version, school boards, cities, states, universities, what is taught with how the South reacted to Reconstruction?
Oh, interesting. I can't speak about what's going on and how the South is teaching Reconstruction. What I was going to talk about today, and then I realized I wasn't going to have time, because I was talking about national policy, I was talking about local state policy. I didn't talk about sectionalism, but the thing that came to mind, I was trying to think of like banned books. And of course, in the South, in part of the first half of the 19th century, there were pamphlets and books that were banned as being dangerous. And that's when you had a moment when you had abolitionist societies who had their mail campaign, and they had this massive campaigns to send pamphlets and writings about abolitionism, about opposing slavery, mass quantities, sending them all around the South. And the Southerners, in one way or another, trying to prevent those books from getting into the South. That was a different way of book banning or pamphlet banning or writing banning. But for sure, the South has its own history of silencing, preventing certain kinds of conversations from happening anywhere, educationally and otherwise. I'm looking partly because there's so much going on in chat today. Man.
I know. I'm yeah. Okay, here's a question from Ryan. Ryan asked a question specifically about the book banning. He says, I have a copy of Henry Ford's The International Jew. I also have a copy of some of the Dr. Seuss books that are now being considered racist materials and being banned. Should both those books be allowed on public school shelves?
I think it depends on how that's framed, right? There are librarians here I know who are going to be able to speak in a more informed way than I am, and I'm going to encourage you to speak out now. I just want to make sure that no, I guess we're okay. I was like sensing something bad, but it's not happening so good. At any rate, I want librarians to speak out about this. To me, should Mein Kampf be in a school library? The International Jew, all of these things that are obviously, ist, define an ist in some way that it's a racist, or should they be in libraries? Perhaps, but if they are, frame them somehow, put them in a section that defines them for what they are, or make them books that students have to ask for, rather than just having them out on the shelf. I don't know. And so I'm speaking actually here out of ignorance, and I want librarians to speak out. And I'm not seeing them so far, but right. No, and you're right, Nancy, that the Dr. Seuss books were not banned. The publisher just decided they weren't going to publish them anymore. So initially there are people saying, you're banning Dr. Seuss. Like, no one banned Dr. Seuss actually at all. They just decided to stop making them. The publisher was virtue signaling on ceasing production. I don't think so. I think the publisher decided that that book, wasn't worth publishing. It was offensive. They didn't want to be responsible for it. I don't think that's signaling. I think that's an act.
Yeah, I remember when Disney stopped sharing Song of the South for that same reason, and you couldn't get it on, well, back then it was VHS. And I remember there were some people that were upset about that, but Disney just said, this doesn't reflect the values of who we are as a company, and it's not the storytelling we want to share with children any longer. So I remember that very distinctly. That was many years ago. That movie's been out of circulation for years. All right, we've got a couple more questions from Dave and one from Dale, but we are already past our time. So I don't know, do we want to?
Can you think these are things I can answer briefly?
No.
No.
That's why I was like, no.
No, not really.
Maybe we can try in the after party, but I know some people don't stick around for that. It's up to you.
Well, let's try at least one more. and then-
Okay. Were there educational texts in the early republic similar to McGuffey's readers focusing on morals and good American values? That might be a quick one.
Well, there were, I've had students write about this. Actually, an undergrad wrote about these children's books that were being produced, like real children's books, like ABC books and various things like that, in which the things being chosen, A is whatever, were very Americanized. So yeah, that there were definitely in one way or another various kinds of children's books and readers that were created very explicitly, again, to instill American values. There was, I know we've talked about this before too, there was a real inferiority complex going on in the United States, that they'd broken away from this place where they had always seen it as the center of all culture, like the everything that was cultured and sophisticated came from England and perhaps France. And now we're a new country and we're cutting ourselves away from that. So not only did Americans have this interest at that point in creating some kind of a national identity and a national culture, they wanted to do so in a way that fostered good civic virtue and citizenship, but also that just made America look good to Americans so that they would see the value of this new country that initially, didn't start out as very much at all.
Yeah. Okay, there's literally one left. I think we can do it. For those, especially on the right, who are about making sure we understand what the founders wrote or thought about originalism, should we not be fostering the idea that K-12 students study what the founders studied when they came up with the Declaration and the Constitution?
So you're asking, should we make students read exactly what the founders read?
That's what he's asking. We do a good bit of that, but oddly enough, it's not necessarily through the history classes. A lot of that, what the founders were reading at the time, is taught through 11th grade English. So the AP English course and the AP US history course are typically both taught in 11th grade. And so there are actually a lot of parallels, and even regular history courses tend to be 11th grade, where they do US literature and US history in most states, not all states. So a lot of that is kind of a cross-curricular approach.
And that's also, that's a really big question, right? Because if you're talking about what the founders read, there are the books that they were trained in and educated in when they were being schooled. There are books and political tracts that they turned to when they were explicitly trying to think about creating a constitution. There's a pretty wide range. So I think there would be some texts that it would make a lot of sense for students to talk about and compare and contrast. It's like in one of my undergrad courses, we read the Articles of Confederation in a pretty great amount of detail, partly so that they can see the contrast between what they had and what came next, but explicitly so that we can decide what people were scared of. What did it reflect about what Americans were thinking at the time? So if you have people read some texts that can, on the one hand, show where some ideas came from, and on the other hand, show their framing for things, I think that's wonderful and makes perfect sense. I think the idea that if you read those things, you will have an originalist view of why and how people created the Constitution, you'd have to do a lot of reading. And you'd have to put yourself in a different time period, right? I obviously, in one way or another, we've talked, I think, about originalism before, the idea that somehow the Constitution is not a living document and that you need to think about what James Madison meant to interpret it correctly. And yet the people who claim that don't always seem interested in knowing what James Madison thought. That's its own problem. That's a topic for another conversation. I'm trying to catch up here. Okay, you guys have been.
We did clear the deck. We got all the questions.
Clear the deck, that's good. Okay, so then let me tell you what's happening now, where we're going next. Okay, so what we do next for those of you who are new, and I'm so pleased there are some new people here. What we are going to do now is go to the after party. What that means is that we will not be recording what goes on for the next half hour. We will stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier and talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you beamed in here through the NCHE website, stay right where you are, and poof, we will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to get to the after party. Leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations and find your way to us, and you too, poof, will instantly be part of the after party. We are running a little late, gosh. I do want to say, as I always say, thank you for being here to take part in the conversation of democracy that we have every week when we talk about these issues, important issues, and talk to each other, throw ideas around, question things in ways that are really the heart of any kind of democracy, that you're free to think different things, to argue, have different ideas, and to be here to engage in them. For this week, I want to give an extra thanks because we were talking about education, and there are so many educators here. I know there are many, many people here who are not educators, but there are a lot of educators here. This is the National Council for History Education. So I want to give a special thanks to you who are here this week and contributing to this conversation, because that's pretty crucially important. So I want to thank you for being here too. I am going to wish that everybody has a wonderful, wonderful week. And I will discover on probably Thursday at far too late an hour what the heck I want to talk about the next day. I try so hard, you guys. I do. I'm even like, I'm going on a taxi ride today. I could think during the taxi ride on what the topic will be. That didn't happen, but I tried. At any rate, see you guys all in a week. Thank you, Annie, and thank you, John, for being here as ever, being part of this, part of the community and creating the community, and for all of your work. You are beyond appreciated when it comes to me. Okay, and let us go to the after party.
Yay.